So today we're going to be discussing imperialism in Africa and especially the Congo in the 19th century. Um, Before we do, though, it's important to really understand African geography. So just from a map right here, we can see the longitude and latitude of the longitude and latitude of Africa. Generally, the birth of agriculture, especially in Europe, Asia, and the Americas took place between about 30 degrees and 45 degrees north of the equator, and then later 30 to 45 degrees south of the equator. And if you can see here, most of Africa lies either south or north of those lines of parallel latitude. So in other words, what this means is that most of Africa is pretty hot and humid. Um, so in the north of Africa, you've actually got the Sahara Desert. And in the central region of Africa, it has, for most of its history, been really dense tropical rainforest. It's only in the real southern tip of Africa, in South Africa, that has any kind of climate that would normally be suitable for agriculture, or at least the kind of grain agriculture that regions like the Fertile Crescent were able to use to develop strong surpluses and civilization. Now, West Africa and much of Africa has had civilization for thousands of years. It's just a different kind of agricultural civilization. They grew things like millet and sorghum, which generally do not have the same kind of storage capacity and potential for huge surpluses that things like wheat and barley have. So basically, because of the latitude of Africa and the climate of Africa, um, it didn't have the ability to grow the same kind of agricultural surpluses. It also meant that Africa, for much of its history, was pretty cut off, at least from Europe. North Africa and, of course, places like Egypt have long, long histories of civilization and of contact with both Europe and Asia. Regions like East Africa have had histories of maritime contact with, like India, for instance, and even in Indonesia. And then regions like West Africa, however, generally have had foraging populations because agriculture is more difficult since it's pretty much rainforest. And then places like Southern Africa um, really didn't even become known to Europeans until the 1600s, when Europeans began to sail around the Horn of Africa trying to find India. So, in other words, Africa was pretty much not well known to Europeans for most of its history. And as we can remember, from about 1500 on, Europe was the most powerful region on Earth. So Africa was kind of an unknown on the map for many Europeans. Africa, by the time the 1500s had come around, the North African Islamic empires were in decline. West African empires like the Malian Empire were also in decline. A lot of this is just timing. Empires tend to become more corrupt as they grow older and more difficult to run. West African empires are no different than any other empire. But you also had things like the Arab slave trade and, more importantly, the Atlantic slave trade that really decimated African populations. So by about the year 1500, many African empires, even if they were strong, were in a period of decline, right around the same time when European empires were in a period of ascent or rise. Um, but by about 1800, Africa was again pretty unknown to European industrialists and European nations. On the left, you can see some basic outlines of concessions, or like territories that European nations wanted to explore, but for the most part, they really had no idea what was in the interior of Africa. On the map to the right, you can see this giant region called Unexplored Region. That was dense tropical rainforest with really only rivers as a way to actually explore in the interior of Africa. The exceptions here were, of course, North Africa, which was a region that had been put into contact by Arab traders for hundreds of years and was well known to Europe. and then Southern Africa, or what today is like South Africa, which had a climate in some ways similar to Europe, and was also an important destination on the way to India. But some of the first Europeans to really discover or to find out more about Africa were missionaries, especially a guy named David Livingstone. He was a Scottish missionary, and he was one of the first to really promote this idea, the civilizing mission. Um, it would be hard to say he was an imperialist. He basically was a Christian who was just trying to promote Christianity. And he would disappear into parts of Africa and his whereabouts were completely unknown to Europeans for decades at a time. And his travels and his writings were eventually found by other European journalists who reported what he had seen in Africa. And so his reports going back to Europe were, kind of aroused the curiosity of other Europeans. So this idea of the civilizing mission, or kind of an excuse for imperialism, in some ways was a pretty genuine attempt by early Europeans. And so for some, European journeying into West Africa and the interior of Africa was first prompted by Christian missionaries. But this would change. So other Europeans began to try and colonize parts of Africa. It started in, for instance, like North Africa, with countries like France, who began to colonize and grow crops in Africa. Algeria is in North Africa. It's close to France. And so this was a fairly, to the French, like a fairly logical next step if they wanted to conquer. So parts of Africa that were already known to Europeans began to be conquered looking into the middle of the 19th century. But as more and more European nations began to explore Africa, there became a need to actually regulate this exploration, at least from the perspective of the Europeans. So what this meant was you had lots and lots of European nations, the United States, countries like Japan were starting to look at imperial territory. And one leader of Germany, a guy named Otto von Bismarck, decided that there needed to be some sort of regulation. And so he called a conference in Berlin in 1884. And the goal of the conference was basically to regulate imperialism in Africa. And the result of this conference was actually the partition of Africa. So you can read some more of the actual results of this conference here. One of them was the establishment of a region in the middle of Africa called the Congo Free State, which was going to be basically designed as like a free trade zone for European businesses. You also had the establishment of specific zones of power, or regions where specific European nations had exclusive territorial rights. So the direct result of this, though, is basically like the partition of Africa into various territories. If you take a look at a map of Africa today, it looks really, really similar to this. And basically, those borders were created by Europeans at the Berlin Conference. So this basically meant that Africa was now part of this imperial scramble by European nations. So imperialism in the Congo was a little bit unique. Congo's right in West Africa, or Central West Africa, and at the Berlin Conference, the region was decided to become a free state. And what this basically meant is that it would be kind of like an open for business area where it wouldn't be under the power of one European leader. It would be open for business. King Leopold II was the king of Belgium, and he became the leader partly because Belgium was such a small state, and he said he would be impartial, basically. And so the idea was that he would kind of make sure that the businesses in the Belgian Congo were operating, and he wouldn't necessarily like use it to profit Belgium. The Congo is a really wealthy area for things like rubber and ivory and copper. And what King Leopold II did is he used these what he called like vacant areas of the Congo to give to companies. And so what he did is he seized what he claimed unused land was, and he gave it over to companies to develop, or concession companies. The problem is it wasn't unused, it was being used by foraging tribes. And because there were no like houses on the land or factories on the land, Europeans considered it unused or vacant, even though it wasn't. You also had King Leopold hiring and using this mercenary force of international mercenaries called the Force Publique. And basically it was to enforce laws, but it wasn't under the control of a specific government. So in a lot of ways, it abused power and was in many ways difficult to manage. And you also had King Leopold demanding taxes from these villages to what he said was to pay for European infrastructure. So basically you had what was supposed to be a free state, this region where businesses would be able to operate and not abuse the local populations. That was the idea. In fact, it became one of the worst places for abuses because there was no region overlooking it. Basically, you had you had European companies coming in and doing whatever they wanted there. And so these foreign concession companies generally used things like forced labor from the Congolese, and sometimes you had mortality rates of up to 50%. That meant half of the people that worked died. And what they were doing was they were harvesting rubber, which comes from trees, and you also had them working in copper mines, hunting elephants and collecting ivory, and all this went back to Europe. Resistance was very difficult because Congo is such a diverse place with so many different languages and ethnicities and different tribes, but there was definitely resistance. You had lots of local indigenous Congolese. You actually had people from areas of Swahili traders in the east of Africa who thought the Europeans were kind of cutting in on their business. And you also had just kind of grassroots resistance. But Europe had far superior technology. The economies had been basically disrupted, so people were kind of a little bit lost. And you also had a really lack of outside information from Europeans because the Congo was such a, basically it was a rainforest, and Europeans didn't really go into the Congo unless they were doing business there. And the businesses, of course, weren't reporting these atrocities. So most Europeans had no idea what was happening. The first people to really publicize this were, for instance, a guy named George Washington Williams. He was an African-American guy, and he went to the Congo kind of on a hopeful visit. He was obviously, his family members had been slaves, and he was interested in kind of seeing Africa or seeing his homeland. When he got there, though, he saw what was going on, and he was shocked, and he wrote to King Leopold. He planned to publicize this, but he actually got sick and died. What happened was, because African geography was so different than European and American geography, there were a lot of diseases there that, Europeans and Americans were not used to. In the same way that there were lots of diseases that Europeans and Americans had when they first arrived in the Americas. So, unfortunately, George Washington Williams never actually publicized this. But you did have slowly more and more people starting to learn what was happening. For instance, you had a guy named Edie Morrell. He was a British shipping clerk, and he was just kind of looking at what was going in and out of the Congo, and he realized that more than 80% of all the shipments that were leaving the Congo and going into the Congo were not for products. They were basically to equip a military state. They were all going to the Force Publique to basically repress the Belgian or the Congolese people. And Morrell basically investigated and decided that he would figure out what was going on, and he did, and it was horrendous. And he started to publicize his reports. Other journalists came to the scene and saw what was happening. Morrell and other journalists discovered George Washington Williams' letters to King Leopold, And soon enough, Europe and the United States and much of the rest of the world realized what was going on. These political reports and cartoons and whatnot really deeply influenced the public. You had then European and American governments that began to press the Belgian government, trying to get them to regulate what was going on and stop the atrocities. And many of these businesses that had been basically contracted by the Congo were prosecuted for human rights violations and sent to jail. But the Congo stayed under Belgian imperial control, and so Europeans thought the answer was basically to make the Congo go under Belgian control instead of be under free trade control, because they thought there wasn't enough regulation. Um, but in total, you had about 10 million people who died in the Congo, and that was just a period of about 20 years. Um, at the Berlin Conference, slavery was outlawed. But as you can see, without actually any kind of government oversight of what was happening, slavery just took a new form and a just as brutal form. And so I think the story of what happened in the Congo is really a story of how ideas like free trade really need some sort of regulation, and also the power of journalism to actually kind of promote what's going on without some sort of impartial critic of what's happening. Atrocities take place, and so journalism is going to become a more and more important force in 20th century history.